In the early 20th century, a book was published in Europe that shook the intellectual world at the time and even made a dent in the popular culture. The book was called The Decline of the West, and it was written by German historian and political scientist Oswald Spengler. The intellectual discussions that developed around that book were very vigorous. Effectively, the book proposed a new way of seeing the development of the human history, no less. Oswald Spengler drew differences between notions of race, culture, and civilization. He identified several existing and historical cultures and civilizations. But the reason the book created such an uproar and discussion actually was not the methodology, but what he said about the civilization of the West. The Decline of the West is a very telling title. Spengler said at the time that the Western civilization is in decline, no less. The reason to say that it made an impact in popular culture is that around that time, a perfume was created called The Decline of the West, to rhyme with that kind of, with a book. And you can judge for yourself if a book, a product meant for highly intellectual consumption made that kind of impact on the popular culture. We can probably be quite sure in saying the book has made an impact. Why to go to that? It's only for the sake of the contrast that I would like to draw. 100 years, moving forward 100 years, into year 2024, another book was published in Europe. The name of that book, the title, is The Defeat of the West. And it was published by French demographer and historian, and combining those two titles, historical demographer, Emmanuel Todd. The book is here in front of me. I'm going to present it to you. That's the book. And the reason I'm presenting this book in such a casual manner, in a language very different from the language in which it was written, is that it has never been translated into English. So for the English-speaking audience, I do not have a copy in English. And that constitutes the first part of this book's mystery. The only reason I could read it, and I will be able to relate to its content and judge it critically, is because it exists in Russian, a language I speak. Interesting, isn't it? Very interesting. And in certain political circles in the West, the people were ready with the speculations as to why the translation into English, which is a language of international communication, was not even made. Maybe it was to limit the book's content, the distribution of its content, the dissemination, somehow. And maybe not. Others said maybe, actually, the non-translation is a result of publishers or intellectuals following the wishes of the author, Emmanuel Todd. Maybe he didn't want to translate it. It doesn't really matter from my point of view how you look at it and what the exact factors are. The book titled The Defeat of the West, that was written in year 2024, on a subject that it tackles, and I'm going to go to the subject in a minute, probably the natural expectation would be that it will be distributed in English language. Irrespective of the intents and purposes, the wishes of the author and the actual reasons, the reality that the non-translation created is that the book became something that is as close as it gets today in the West to a forbidden text. All of us know about something that is a forbidden text in historical terms, approaching in the Middle Ages. For example, the church tried to limit distribution of certain materials, certain books. Certain texts, lists of these texts were declared as forbidden for consumption, for distribution. The attempt to limit distribution of certain content was perhaps one of the remarkable features of the Soviet regime. As it is well known, I think that under Soviet regime, the whole alternative system of publications developed, which was called samizdat. Samizdat, the literal translation of that would be self-publishing. When people, many of them approached state agencies for publication, many of them were rejected, but some of them didn't even bother, and they resorted to something that was called self-publishing. Self-publishing at the time took form of approaching somebody who was a typist by profession, who was in possession of a typewriter. Typically, it would be a woman. Typically, this would be a woman working in a normal, completely legitimate day job, for example, as a secretary to a notary. And these people in possession of a typewriter could type a book, a text that was offered to them, and then create several copies of that book. And then in that way, that through informal channels, the books were distributed. Needless to say that that typist, that woman, with a perfectly legitimate day job, would be probably the most interesting person around any dinner table. She would know absolutely anything, any kind of dissident thoughts that were in circulation in the Soviet Union at the time. We are not talking about those measures. Those measures are not taken, or are, let's say, they're irrelevant in the West today, where actually the methods to create your own text and distribute it, for example, in the form of a video, are available to all. But anyhow, one very effective measure to limit distribution of anything is not to translate it to languages that everyone speaks. And that's what happened to this book. That's what constitutes the first mystery. I'm not going to solve it here. But perhaps what I'm going to say next is will go some way towards the solution, towards the revealing the mystery. So who is Emmanuel Todd, and why should we listen to him? Why a book, no matter how attractively called, be a matter of public attention? Why does it deserve to be analyzed anyhow? It is because the book addresses, in a way that is uncompromisingly empirical, a very interesting geopolitical phenomenon, which is the war between Russia and Ukraine. Or, as Emmanuel Todd prefers to see it, it's a war between Russia and the West. That's the first thing. I think, irrespective of political opinions that people hold, we will probably agree that we live at a time of major geopolitical changes. The war, or the Cold War, when it happened, was perfectly well understood by anyone who paid attention. The terms and conditions were clear. These were two competing intellectual and regimes, the West and Russia, communist in aspiration, socialist in reality on the side of the Soviet Union, free market, freedom of speech on the side of the West. And these geopolitical entities, the Soviet Union and the West, presented competing systems for life, effectively, for organizing public and private affairs and the economies. That's what stood at the core of the Cold War. It's entirely unclear what kind of ideological element, ideological core is there for a contemporary conflict between Russia and the West. That is not something that is being answered necessarily in the book, but it's part of the background that I would like to be there. That is the question of the war, the question of the role of the West, the role of the United States of America, and what it all means, not necessarily about Russia, but what it all means about the Western civilization, where it stands. That's the question that constitutes the core of Emmanuel Todd's book. I must say also, almost parenthetically, that the war between Russia and Ukraine, or between Russia and the West, as Todd prefers to see it, is a pretext, in a way. It doesn't even need to be there. It's simply a lens or a mirror through which, an excuse almost, for Emmanuel Todd to say a few things about the Western civilization, and to give the shortest version of his thesis is that the West is being defeated on the Eastern Front, The West is being defeated not because Russia necessarily wants to win or insists on winning in militarily terms, maybe it even can't do it. The West is being defeated, in a way dying, due to its own weakness. The West is in a state of economic, on the one hand, and spiritual crisis. This is, to give his thesis in the shortest possible terms, what leads the West to engage with Russia on Ukrainian soil in the first place. And this is what explains its hesitancy in dealing with Russia. And that's what explains, as Todd understands, the surprising resilience of Russia as well. I will talk about each of these matters in greater depth and greater length, but I would like now to go to the original question and ask, okay, Emmanuel Todd said that, what does make the book, over and above the fact that it addresses a very central subject, worthy of attention? And this is where things get serious, because Emmanuel Todd has been there for a while now. It's not his first book. And in the past, he proved himself as a very capable prophet. Somewhere in the mid-70s, when the military and social power role of the Soviet Union was pretty much undoubted, you could say that the Soviet Union was at the height of its power in the 70s, Emmanuel Todd predicted its collapse, no less. He predicted it not analyzing the speeches of the Soviet leaders, but by looking at the data. Which data? I can hear you asking. Data on infant mortality, so mortality of children aged under 1, and certain socioeconomic indicators. That and that alone was sufficient for him to issue that kind of diagnosis, the diagnosis of a Soviet society as a society in crisis, and the Soviet system as a system that is about to collapse. Interesting, isn't it? So that is the CV and the legacy of that individual. He could do it, I must say parenthetically, at the time that not many people even conceived the possibility of the collapse of Soviet Union. When you speak to Sovietologists and various historians of Russia, they will tell you almost inevitably in all of their lectures something along the line that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a completely unexpected event, or at the very least that the consensus, the mainstream of Sovietology in the 70s, the 80s, 50s, 60s did not trade in that idea, did not anticipate this. If you go a little bit into deeper, let's say, you could see that in a large scholarly community of Sovietologists at the time, there were certain people who brought up this opportunity. One of them was George Kennan, who is, of course, a major Sovietologist American Sovietologist, who said in the year 1946, if I'm not mistaken, he brought up this possibility that one day there will be some sort of prolonged decay of the Soviet Union, and one day it may come to complete disintegration. That, allowing that possibility, however, is very, very, very different from issuing a specific prediction that there are signs of decay, there are signs of decline, and one day there will be a decline, there will be followed by the actual decline, which is what Emmanuel Todd did. I would like to return now to the point to his methodology. And his methodology, you could say, was quite minimalistic. He looked at certain demographic developments and said, I can see the decline and the end on the basis of these demographic developments alone. How is that possible, I can hear you asking? Because demography is a science about how populations grow, how they are created, and how they die. And the way in which they die reflects the quality of their lives. That is very easily understood. We see now very conventionally in indices like, for example, life expectancy as an indication of the quality of life. So it's as straightforward as that. Emmanuel Todd looked at the time at infant mortality and effectively said the following thing. If I see worsening in this indicator, I see effectively the lack of desire or capacity of that particular entity called Soviet Union to invest in preserving health of its weakest members and its future, because we're talking about children. What exactly happened? Emmanuel Todd did not know, and he couldn't know. Much of the Soviet statistics could not be obtained at the time. By that told him that something is going on. If the medical system and the economic system that underlies that medical system, that medical establishment, is no longer capable to control infant mortality, if that indicator stabilizes, or worse still, if infant mortality of very young children increases, the system entered some sort of crisis. And it's only a matter of time when we see that crisis, other expressions of that, other signals. That, I would say, is a strength of demographic analysis, and the clear advantage of demographic analysis over other types of analysis. There are certain types of statistics easily collectible, for example, infant mortality, and other types of statistics that will be presented further, that can be used to use the Todd's term as moral statistics. So they, in actual fact, measure the moral or economic state of the society in a broad sense, and from them, the future of the society can be predicted, gleaned. So there are many reasons to translate this book into the new book, The Defeat of the West, into English, not in the least. We should allow ourselves a thought that somebody who predicted the unimaginable in the mid-70s should be able to say something very interesting today, using effectively the same methodology. Because this hasn't happened, I decided to create a series of lectures analyzing different arguments made by Emmanuel Todd. And this presentation will not be simple retelling of what the book says, but I would call it a critical analysis, or maybe at times even a competitive analysis. The first question that I will ask with respect to any argument promoted by Todd is very simple. Is that true? When Emmanuel Todd talks about the conflict between Russia and the West, as opposed to Russia and Ukraine, is this correct on the basis of information available to myself? First of all, we're now in the year 2026. Things are a little clearer now compared to the time that Emmanuel Todd wrote it. He wrote the book that was published in 2024 would have to be written in 2022, 2023, when the Russian-Ukrainian war was very fresh still. So that first question, is that actually true? Does this sound true on the basis of newly available evidence, the evidence available to myself, other types of moral statistics which I have, and which Emmanuel Todd suggests should be relevant to the question? That's the way I'm planning to work through the various arguments made in the book. Emmanuel Todd talks about the crisis of the West, the crisis that effectively leads the West to behave in the way it does. That crisis, spiritual crisis on the one hand, but also relatedly, economic crisis, is what leads Europe to engage with Russia in a particular manner. In relation to that as well, I will say, is that true on the basis of what happened since and on the basis of other statistics available to me? What you will see effectively is a peer review or a scholarly analysis of the arguments promoted by Emmanuel Todd with more data. When I say that this analysis will be critical, I will also say that there are issues that are not mentioned in the book, and any book that today that is written about the Western civilization, and particularly spiritual or political crisis that this civilization is supposedly going through, would certainly be expected to mention the demographic change that's especially Western Europe is undergoing. The proportion of people born outside of the countries of Europe, so the proportion of foreign-born population in Europe, in the Western Europe, is in double digits. almost universally. The proportion of population from the Muslim background or Muslim faith is in some places already in double digits, and among the youngest cohorts, it is certainly in double digits in many countries of Europe. This is something that is well known from various reputable data producers such as Pew Research Institute, the censuses in the countries that collect this information, etc. It would be very interesting to see that this information has close to zero presence in Emmanuel Todd's book. That is another question, is another mystery that I'm hoping to be able to solve. So, if I have given you sufficient appetite, follow the analysis in the next few videos, and we will get closer and closer to revealing the mystery, which is behind the book, The Defeat of the West.